I'd like to start by saying that our whole Love Symposium was really inspired by Lillian. She gave us a book review, she talked about the general theory of love, and it just resonated with everyone in many different ways. So I think in this symposium we're going to take it across different levels. Lillian has beautifully explained the brain and the limbic system, so I won't have to do that. But I'm taking it to the next level, which is basically looking at attachment, the attachment process and how it's influenced by the limbic system, and how we have attachment processes that follow us from infancy to adulthood. And I'm going to take us to a study that you may have seen if you went to the poster sessions that I did with my students just recently. We've just written them up this week, so it's very fresh. But we're going to compare how psychologists help individuals who come to us with broken attachment patterns or difficult attachment patterns, or who are, more specifically, they're angry at somebody in their lives. We're going to look at what a psychologist might say or do to help them get through the process of, say, forgiveness and reconciliation. And then I'm going to look at how Christians told us they try to deal with anger with somebody that they're close to. So that's the overview. So as Lillian has explained, all of us have a limbic system that basically is pre-wired, so that if something dangerous comes across our environment, in the old days it was a bear and everybody uses the bear example, we're either going to fight it or we're going to flee it, whatever seems sensible in the situation. Actually, we don't have time to think of whether it's sensible, we just do it. And that happens too in all other elements of our lives. When we have a conflictual relationship, for example, if somebody tries to harm us in some way by slapping us or hurting us or even saying something vicious to us, we have two options essentially. Either we get away from them, or we stand up to them and we use whatever tools we have to fight back. So it frames our emotional experience, the limbic system. We have this universal fight or flight response. And it's going to influence all of our relationships at a very basic level, even though we have means to adapt and the relationships become more complex and we become more sophisticated in our ways of either fleeing or fighting. In the 1980s, there was a woman named Harriet Goldhar Lerner, who's a psychotherapist, who wrote a lot of books that started with dances of, and she looked at the dances of anger, the dances of attachment, the dances of intimacy. And essentially, her books were a teaching tool for individuals who wanted to learn how to be more effective in their communication and essentially to have better love relationships, to be more securely attached to their partners, to be able to stay in their partnerships, and to enjoy each other's company more. So it seems that many of our early experiences shape our predispositions in some way. We all have the ability to respond by fleeing or fighting, but what occurs in those limbic dances, in the moments that we bond with our caregivers using the mirror neurons and other biological bases, we tend to react to those faces of our mothers and fathers. We tend to respond to the environment we experience all the time with all our senses, even before we can think about it. We're being affected by how people handle relationships around us. And this in many ways influences the pattern of our relationships that may continue for the rest of our lives. But there's another part to this, and that part is what you might call personality differences. In infancy, we tend to differentiate between babies that are shy, happy, or a little bit irritable. And those babies are going to have an influence on the parents, but the parents have their own dispositions. If you like, they have the adult version of shy, happy, or irritable. So you can imagine if you happen to be born an irritable child with a couple of irritable parents, you may easily come to see a psychologist later in life. Now, aren't we all glad that there are some very happy babies and totally happy parents, so that not everybody has to come to see a psychologist later in life? But we aren't stuck with these patterns as something that we cannot change, as fixed and rigid. Instead, whatever we experience through life as adolescents or children and eventually as adults will shape how we respond to our natural tendencies. And these are the two tendencies. The tendencies to fight or flee, or to react the way our parents did, and the tendencies to be ourselves, instantly happy, instantly shy, instantly irritable. In my family, you may wonder why I'm studying this. In my family, there's quite a few irritable personalities. And that means that all my life I've had to figure out what to do when I feel irritated right away. I'm always irritated. And I try to use a lot of different tools. And there's tools from psychotherapy and tools from Christianity that are making my life a lot easier. And I've watched the younger generations in my family too. I have nieces and nephews. I see the irritable ones, and I'm just really enjoying it because I see the journey that they're going through. And their parents are sometimes able to make a big difference because they understand that instant irritability that comes with your personality before you've even had time to think about it. So insecure infants seek help as adults more often than secure infants. And it seems that anxiety and later anger are more prominent in infants and adults with insecure attachment. So the people that are still anxious after all these years come to see a psychologist later in life. And their goal is to improve their relationships and deal more effectively with these feelings. Sometimes it's not about the outer relationship, it's the intrapersonal feelings. You want to know what to do when you can't stop ruminating about that horrible person that did that horrible thing to you. You want to know how to move your thoughts into something that's more positive, gratitude, or a sense of calm or well-being. What psychologists have found is, to some extent, cognitive therapy is highly effective, meaning in some illnesses like depression, you can get people to cognitively appraise why they're angry, and then to start to shape their thoughts so they don't have to instantly get angry at what's going on around them. But what we know from the limbic system and some of the data presented in the book that Lillian reviewed show us that you can't change your emotional feelings, your well-being. You can't regulate everything by thinking about it. It's an important component, but it's only the cognitive component. For somebody who's in a difficult relationship where they feel angry, you can intellectually decide you won't be angry anymore. But there's much more to letting go of that anger than just making the decision, although it has to be the start. So irritable babies and shy or slow to warm up babies, all their lives will be dealing with their anxieties or anger. And they'll have to regulate these emotions. If we look at the therapeutic literature, there's ways of mediating anger responses. Therapeutic literature tells us that many styles of psychotherapy are effective. I used to teach a parent training group when I was 30 years younger, and the children in that group all had behavior problems of some sort, like ADHD or oppositional defiant disorder. And the best way I thought to help them at the time was to help their parents, because they were young, 8 to 11 years old. And they would, parents would come to a group where they could get a lot of support from the other parents, lots of social support, and people could share their ideas about how they would best manage those children. And what they were all talking about essentially was how they manage their own parenting concerns, but their anger, their anxiety, their ability to frame positive thoughts about their children. So that was a type of psychotherapy to help mediate anger responses in their children, but also in themselves at the same time. And we have other more modern approaches. There are very common approaches now. It's common to use Zen meditation approach as a mindfulness-based therapy where you come to accept what is in your life in the here and now and to not try to get away from it or to fight it, but to accept it and then to let it go. And then there's anger management groups. These are really popular. They're very popular in high schools where you have angry adolescents. Some of my research has been about juvenile delinquents in France. That's the term they use. We might use young offenders. And how to help them before they commit crimes, how to help them before they act out. At the time I started studying this, about 2003, there were a lot of young people burning cars in Paris. I don't know if you remember that era, but it was unbelievable to me that because they had no other way to voice their limitations and their anger and their frustration at being stuck in poor housing, where they lived in terrible conditions, in slums we might say. They burnt the cars and wanted to be, it was a way of saying, let me into society in some way. So people have tried to use anger management groups with inmates, with angry adolescents, with couples. And to some extent, it's been quite successful, and it continues today. When Harriet Goldhar Lerner, the researcher I mentioned earlier and therapist, talked about anger in women, she noted that many women are locked into ineffective expressions of anger, and they suffer just as deeply as people who get angry all the time. In other words, many women who are, say, now in their 50s or 60s may have been part of a social culture that dictated that women should not get angry. They should smile. They should be happy. They should please. Not only that, they needed to take care of the emotional well-being of the people around them, like their family, spouse, colleagues. So if they did have a justifiably good reason to be angry, somebody abusing them in some way, somebody swearing at them at work, a boss treating them like a slave, then they should really have some ability to address that assertively and deal with it. But if you deny that you have any anger at all, it's just not going to help you. So it's not just anger and fighting that women learn to fear. We avoid asking precise questions and making clear statements when we unconsciously suspect that doing so would expose our differences, make us feel uncomfortable, and leave us standing alone. So what women really fear if they get angry is they'll be left alone. They won't have the emotional bonds that they crave. Family members will disappear. Okay, now this takes us to the sample that my students gathered with 3 case studies where we looked at Christian women over 35 who, and we asked them open-ended questions about what they did with their anger when they were angry. And quickly we saw common variables, and I'll talk about those later, but one of the first major themes that we saw across all 3 cases was that women don't feel comfortable with anger and guilt. And in fact, there's a sacred obligation not to carry the anger. So Jesus said to the disciples, if you forgive people their sins, God in heaven will forgive you your sins, but if you do not, God will not forgive sins. So for Christians, and particularly the Christian women in our sample, failing to forgive others produced a heavy burden of guilt. They couldn't immediately forgive, but they felt bad about themselves that they hadn't forgiven. In addition, they felt that God could not forgive them. Not all of them felt the same feelings, but those were samples of feelings. So women have long been discouraged from discussing anger. We learn to fear our anger. We're nurturers and soothers. But this anger signals a necessity for change. Anger in our sample of 3 Christian women. One individual denied experiencing anger, had learned to defer to sadness, disappointment, worry for the person who created the anger-invoking situation. I think this was in the case study of the woman who was angry with her brother. And the brother continued to distance himself because she'd criticized him. Told him, no, you can't do what you're doing, it's wrong. And she denied that she felt anger at all. She could only feel sadness, disappointment, or worry for the person that had created the anger. That could well be true because some practicing Christians over time do stop actually addressing anger and quickly trying to move it into another feeling. On the other hand, it could also be true that the anger was there and that's why she criticized him, but she couldn't articulate it in a way that would make her feel acceptable to herself given her expectations about being a Christian. So our participants talked quickly about wanting to pardon themselves and others. Some would say, I wasn't the best I could be with my daughter. I was angry with her and I shouldn't have been, but I want to pardon myself. I'll give it to God. I'll let go and let God take care of that. And I want to be a peacemaker as quickly as possible. So some women had strong perceptions of guilt in relation to not living up to their own expectations, which was to not feel and not express anger. Several mechanisms exist to reframe the guilt and let go of the guilt. One is summed up by 2 participants who use the same expression, letting go and letting God. It's not an expression that I've used, so maybe it's one that's current now for churchgoers. What is letting go and letting God, and what is forgiveness? If you cannot resolve within yourself whatever anger or strong negative feelings you're experiencing, you can bring it to God in prayer and faith that God will handle what you cannot. But the second mechanism is forgiveness, and there are two components. One is changing thoughts and feelings from negative to positive. This is where the thinking can help, but also rebuilding a positive relationship or reconciliation with a person you've been angry with. Psychologists believe there are just two simple processes, and they're separate. Forgiveness, which is the intellectual decision to forgive, and the emotional component of forgiveness is an intrapersonal process. On the other hand, reconciliation, which is the restoration of relationship with the anger-invoking person, is an interpersonal process. So we like variables, we like neatness, we like to analyze things with numbers, so it's helpful to separate everything into an operational definition that's not confusing. What about Christians? Christians have a little different depth to their definition of forgiveness, and there's a third party. Many Christians see divine forgiveness and relationship repair with God, and the emotional forgiveness and the relationship repair with the anger-invoking person as part of a single process. So you can see how that's kind of an extra burden for the woman who's Christian. She could possibly feel that God might be angry with her in addition to the person that's angry with her, or vice versa. You have to take it into account. And what I found really interesting as I read and analyzed the transcripts was you can't pick them apart. They talk about it together. I went back and found that this is also in the literature, the idea that Christians need divine forgiveness, not just the forgiveness of the partner with whom they've had the conflict. I think it went the wrong way. So I think I've just said that. It's been confirmed in our transcripts. So what is the insight to be gained here for clinical psychologists who help people rebuild relationships that need repair? If to completely forgive a transgression, a woman thinks she must reconcile with a transgressor, this could put her in a difficult position. For example, she might feel conflict over re-entering an abusive relationship, yet feel distance from the divine if her beliefs dictate that she must repair and reconcile all close relationships in order to fulfill her duty as God, to God. As God. Oh, that's a Freudian slip. Please don't notice it. Okay. I used to work with abused women in my clinical practice quite a while ago now. And in that era, let's say the 1980s, early 1990s, in the early 1990s, women at that point were talking about the fact that if they were Christian, they felt they needed to get back into the marriage. And so there had to be a way to help them see that going back into an abusive relationship is not what God would want, or not what they needed to do. So this is where psychologists have thought this through. Psychologists who are sensitive to the individual's religious needs can help by clarifying distinctions between emotional forgiveness, that intrapersonal process, letting go of the baggage, not carrying around resentment, not thinking about what has happened, and reconciliation, which is a product of a relationship that requires mutually trustworthy behavior. So if my husband is going to continue to beat me or abuse me in other ways, I can't go back to that relationship because I'm not in relationship. There have to be two mutually trustworthy behaviors. I think many Christian women see this anyway, but some who really follow beliefs in a fundamentalist kind of way may hold on to that idea. It all depends on socialization, of course, and individual differences. But some women at that era, when I was a clinical psychologist, did think they had to get back together. Their relationship was everything. And I think that's probably why the feminist movement had such a huge impact on Quebec in the late 1960s, 1969. At that time, most women were Catholic. Most women were married. Many had 13 to 24 children. The average birth was high. And they went to see their parish priests when there was problems in the relationship. And they were encouraged to go back to their husband. And, some of the other things, like dress appropriately, make the dinner, calm the children. And we just didn't think that. By the time the 1970s came along, the women's rights movement, second wave, was in full force, and Christian women were incorporating ideas that came from secular women's movements, that there has to be equity in the relationship and two people have to be involved in the forgiveness and reconciliation. Just forgiving and entering the relationship will not work. I found one interesting anecdote in our 3-case study, and that was that women negotiated their own types of reconciliation. Women are creative. People have their own solutions. If they could not maintain a mutually trustworthy relationship because the other party was not willing. So one woman could not reconcile with her angry brother. He was keeping the distance and keeping the anger alive. What did she do? She continued to interact with his wife and provide all the things she would provide normally as an aunt. Birthday gifts for the child, inviting them to family events, and just not intruding too much in their lives, but being available and present. And as she succeeded, she told in her transcript, of actually having the son want to begin to correspond with her in some way. So her approach was working. Didn't have to follow someone else's script. So I'm going to end my talk there. I took you to the level of relationships, and now I'm going to leave it to my colleague, Allison, to move on to another level.